All right. The Tedeschi Trucks Band finishing up our first set tonight on the Burnt Toast Show from their album called I Am the Moon, Part 1. They had a four-part series of EPs that came out in 2023 called I Am the Moon, Parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is from the first part. As I said, that's a composition called Pasaquan, which is a 7-acre art compound near Buena Vista, Georgia, that was founded by Eddie Owens Martin, who called himself Saint Eom. And I invite you to Google that. That's some pretty interesting stuff. But that was Derek Trucks on the lead guitar, Brendan Boone on the bass, Gabe Dixon on the keyboards, Isaac Eady and Tyler Greenwell on the drums, the Tedeschi Trucks Band. Before that, we heard Richard Alpert, who took the spiritual name Ram Dass when he went to India in the late 60s, maybe it was 1970. But he wrote a very influential book, kind of a hippie Bible, called Be Here Now, back in the day. And a lot of people were very influenced by that. I think that the interesting thing about Ram Dass is that he was the guy that wasn't for sale. I always thought that was very beautiful. And he wasn't trying to sell you anything. He was just trying to explain his path and how he came to his beliefs or lack of beliefs. And he wasn't really spiritual in this direction or any other. And he had gotten there in a lot of different ways. He was, as Richard Alpert, he was a professor at Harvard with Timothy Leary when they would do the LSD, when they did the LSD experiments at Harvard, and promptly got kicked out for that. But he went on to a very interesting life. And this culture and this world misses Ram Dass very much. That was him talking about fear. And there's lots of that going on right now. Before Ram Dass, we heard Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson from a 1977 album that they did with the group that they called the Midnight Band. It was on Arista Records, big-time label for Gil Scott-Heron. Came out in September of 1977. Brian Jackson featured on the keyboards. Gil Scott-Heron, of course, the great poet and singer. And that was called Wild Golia, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind. And that also has some social commentary going on there that I think still may be kind of timely. But that was Gil Scott-Heron, Brian Jackson. Of course, we're going back through the playlist here as we go, if you're following along in your hymn book. And this is a new format, so this is we're figuring it out. Before Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson, we heard Richard Pryor, one of his many appearances on Sesame Street in the 1970s, with his take on the alphabet. Before that, we heard something new, three new things actually, something new from Little Feat, something that came out in May of this past year. There was their 18th LP. It's called Strike Up the Band. That was a track called 3 Days of Heaven and 4 Days of Work, written by Scott Sherrard, the guitarist, Bill Payne, the keyboard player, and Tony Leone, the drummer. Scott Sherrard on the guitar and the lead vocals, Bill Payne on the keyboards, Sam Clayton on percussion, Tony Leone on the drums, Kenny Gradney on the bass, Fred Tackett on the guitar. And Kenny Gradney, Bill Payne, and Sam Clayton have all been with that band since 1972. Before Little Feat, we heard Robin Ford from a new album called Two Shades of Blue that he recorded in his new home of London. And that was a track called I Make the Weather. And that was Johnny Henderson, who he borrowed from Matt Schofield's band, on the keyboards, Ianto Thomas on the drums, and Robin Malarkey on the bass. Robin Ford, of course, on guitar and vocals. Robin Ford played guitar with the LA Express, Tom Scott and the LA Express, as a teenager, and Joni Mitchell, also as a teenager. She kind of co-opted the LA Express to tour with her, and he was involved in that. It was some really great playing on the album Miles of Isles. He later played, speaking of Miles, he later played with Miles Davis as well. He was also a member of the Yellow Jackets and has done a lot of session work and has had a consistently brilliant career. Great guitar player, Robin Ford. Before that, we heard something new, a new single from Soul Live called East Side. They've been sort of together, not together, together, not together for quite some time. They were very active between 2000 and about 2010, and then sort of got into some other projects. But now they're doing this. Alan Evans on the drums, Eric Krasno on the guitar, Neil Evans on the keyboards. Soul Live, a big favorite of the Burnt Toast Show. Before Soul Live, we heard an album from 2016, David Bowie's 26th and final album called Black Star. And that album came out on January 8th, 2016, and Bowie died on January 10th, 2016. So it was kind of a big shock. and have a new album coming out. I remember listening to the album when it came out and thinking, well, I hope he tours. And that was not to be. Nobody knew that he was sick. But a great album to go out on. That's a song called Lazarus, which seems to be about his own death in some ways. David Bowie on the guitar and the vocals, Donnie McCaslin on the tenor saxophone and the flute, Jason Lindner on keyboards, Ben Monder on the guitar, Tim LaFave on the bass, some really great bass playing there, and Mark Juliana on the drums. These are all basically New York-based jazz musicians, although Tim LaFave has played with the Tedeschi Trucks Band and the Black Crowes, among many others. But those were mostly jazz musicians that David had heard around New York at that time, David Bowie. Before that, we checked out the Mahavishnu Orchestra from their debut album called The Intermounting Flame that was released in November of 1971, an extremely influential album on the style of jazz we call fusion. And that was, a John McLaughlin composition, Mahavishnu being his spiritual name given to him by his guru, Sri Chinmoy. Mahavishnu, John McLaughlin on guitar, Jerry Goodman on the violin, Jan Hammer on the keyboards, Rick Laird on the bass, and Billy Cobham on the drums, who kind of reinvented the sound of jazz drums on that particular album. Before that, Weather Report from their sixth LP from March of 1976 called Black Market. We heard a Wayne Shorter composition, Elegant People, and just an amazing track and a great groove. Joe Zawinul on the keyboards, Wayne Shorter on the tenor saxophone, Alfonso Johnson on the bass, Chester Thompson on the drums, who had come out of Frank Zappa's band and would later join Genesis for many years as their tour drummer, and Alex Acuna on percussion. Before that, we heard Santana from their second album called Abraxas, a beautiful, beautiful album. That came out in September of 1970. That was Incident at Neshaber. Carlos Santana on guitar, Greg Raleigh on the organ, Michael Shreve on the drums, David Brown on the bass, Michael Carabello on the congas and percussion, Chapito Arias on the timbales and percussion, and Albert Gianquinto, special guest there, on piano. He co-wrote the song with Carlos Santana. Santana, Incident at Neshaber. Before that, we heard Cheech and Chong from their third LP, Los Cachinos, from 1973, with the Evelyn Woodhead Speed Reading Course. And it's taken longer for me to describe it than the track actually lasted. But it's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. And you heard it right here on Roller Derby. Before that, we started off with the Allman Brothers and a track called Ain't Wastin' Time No More. It was their first album without Duane Allman. He had passed away from a motorcycle accident in October of 1971 after the huge success of their album At Fillmore East, which came out earlier that year. It was recorded in March of 1971 at the Fillmore East, Bill Graham's Fillmore East in New York. This album came out in February of 1972, and they were working on this album with Duane, but they had to finish it without him. So the first side was the first album without Duane. The first side was the first recordings without Duane, and there were only 3 tracks there, but they're really killer. This was the opening track and the lead single, and Ain't Wasting Time No More, Greg Allman composition, Greg Allman on piano, organ, and vocals, Dickie Betts on the lead guitar, Barry Oakley on the bass, and J-Mo Johnson and Butch Trucks on the drums. I want to remind everybody that this is the Burnt Toast Show. We have a new format happening here, and I hope you really dig it. And I want to remind everybody that there is a link in the description on this video to a link tree. And if you feel like you would like to donate, please do. We appreciate that. We'll have other options for you as we develop, and we may change format somewhat yet, but this is the way we're going to do it right now. I hope you're enjoying this. As I said, if you have YouTube Premium, it was just straight through. If not, I apologize for the ads. But anyway, I want to remind you that our sponsor for tonight is Premier Chiropractic at 7113 West Jefferson Boulevard in Fort Wayne. It's an affordable walk-in chiropractic clinic built around Dr. John McDonald. Dr. John sponsoring the Burnt Toast Show. So we want to thank them, and thank you so much for checking this out. I also want to remind you that since this is on YouTube, this is hopefully retraining your algorithm toward music, toward Burnt Toast Show style music, and maybe you'll find some things on your own. And that's what I want you to do. I want this to be an adventure that we all share. We're going to continue on now with a couple of songs before we close out this section of the show. The first song we'll listen to is from Steely Dan from their second LP from July of 1973 called Countdown to Ecstasy, and we'll listen to a Walter Becker and Donald Fagen composition called Your Gold Teeth. That was Your Gold Teeth Part 1. Your Gold Teeth Part 2 is on Katie Lied, 1975 album. But this was Donald Fagen on the lead vocals and the keyboards. Some really nice keyboard work from Donald Fagen on this. Walter Becker on the bass, Denny Diaz and Jeff Skunk Baxter on the guitars, and Jim Hodder on the drums. This was the last album that they did sort of as a band, where there weren't ringers brought in or just done with a studio group completely. After that, we'll hear Les McCann from a really great album called Invitation to Openness that was released in 1972, kind of influenced, I think, by Miles Davis's Bitches Brew album. We'll hear a track called Pooh Pie Maguchi and His Friends that Les McCann had recorded earlier in his career, but this is a more expansive version featuring Yosef Lateef on the woodwinds and Alphonse Mouzon on the drum solo at the end, which is a killer drum solo. Les McCann on the piano, the electric piano, the synthesizers, the arrangement, and he was the conductor of all this. Yosef Lateef, as I said, on the woodwinds, David Spinoza and Cornell Dupree on the guitars, Corky Hale on the harp, Jody Christian on the electric piano, Bill Salter on electric bass, Jimmy Rouser on the acoustic bass, Alphonse Mouzon and Bernard Purdy, two of the greatest drummers of all time, on the drums, and Buck Clark and Ralph McDonald on percussion. So Steely Dan and Les McCann coming right up. Dan and McCann coming up next on the Burnt Toast Show. Thanks for tuning in.